Can you imagine? After 3 long, brutal years, the armies of the First Crusade had actually done it. They'd captured Jerusalem. But they barely had time to celebrate. A massive army was already on the march to take it all back. So we're going to dive into the story of their final, decisive battle and the 4 key factors that led to one of the most unlikely victories in history.
Right, let's get into this, because on paper, this looks impossible. You've got the Crusaders, who are exhausted, outnumbered 2-1, and 1,000 miles from home. And on the other side, the Fatimid army, fresh, huge, and fighting right in their own backyard. So how on earth did this happen? Was it pure military genius? A miracle from God? Or was something else going on entirely? So, to get our heads around this, we're going to break it down. We'll look at the 4 main reasons historians point to: the skill of the Crusader leaders, the disunity of their enemies, the sheer power of their religious belief, and the critical help they got along the way. And then we'll ask the big question: was this victory really a sure thing?
Okay, let's set the stage for this final, dramatic showdown. The Crusaders had just taken their ultimate prize, but the real fight for survival was just beginning.
As you can see from this timeline, things were incredibly tense. Less than a month after the bloody capture of Jerusalem, a Fatimid army of 20,000 is sitting just down the coast at Ascalon, ready to wipe them out. And what were the Crusaders doing? Well, what they did best: arguing. Godfrey of Bouillon, the new ruler of Jerusalem, had to march out with just a handful of men because other leaders, like Raymond of Toulouse, were still squabbling over who got what. It wasn't until August 10th, with the enemy practically at the gates, that they finally got their act together. Just 2 days later, they rolled the dice on a single, all-or-nothing surprise attack.
So this brings us to our first big factor. Was the Crusade success really down to the brilliant leadership of its commanders? Well, it's complicated. On one hand, you had some seriously skilled commanders, guys like Raymond of Toulouse, who'd fought Muslims in Spain, or Baumond of Charonto, who was seen as a tactical wizard. They could adapt on the fly. But, and this is a huge but, their egos were a constant problem. Beaumont and Raymond hated each other. Baldwin of Boulogne literally just left the main army to go grab his own kingdom over in Edessa. And like we just saw, they were still bickering right before the Battle for Ascalon. So, you see, their leadership was a real double-edged sword. They were brilliant in a fight, but their infighting nearly sank the whole expedition time and time again. And this quote from historian Thomas Asbridge really hits the nail on the head. He's talking about a moment during the Battle of Dorylaeum, where Bohemond's army was ambushed and nearly destroyed. For 5 hours, just through the sheer force of his personality and skill, he held them together until help arrived. It was in these moments of total crisis that the strength of individual leaders really did save the day. All right, let's move on to factor 2. This is the argument that the Crusaders didn't really win so much as their opponents lost. Was their success just a fluke? A product of a hopelessly divided Islamic world? The Crusaders basically walked into a political powder keg. The Near East was completely fractured. You had the Sunni Seljuk Turks in Syria, who were mortal enemies of the Shia Fatimids in Egypt, the 2 main powers the Crusaders faced. These groups hated each other, maybe even more than they hated the invaders. On top of that, the Seljuk Empire itself had fallen into a chaotic civil war after their sultan died in 1092. So local rulers, like the brothers who ruled Aleppo and Damascus, were way more interested in fighting each other than some weirdos from Europe. This was the Crusaders' single biggest advantage. They weren't fighting an empire, they were fighting a bunch of squabbling warlords. I mean, just listen to this. This quote from the Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir is just incredible. He's describing the scene right before the huge battle for Antioch. Kerboga, the general leading the massive Muslim army, was so arrogant and insufferable that his own commanders decided to abandon him in the middle of the battle. They literally chose to let the Crusaders win rather than let Kerboga get more powerful. That's not a military defeat, that's a political meltdown, and it handed the Crusaders the most important city on their path. So, if the leadership was shaky and the enemy was divided, what on earth kept this army going through starvation, disease, and just horrific losses? Well, our third factor suggests the answer was faith. Pure, unshakable religious zeal. The story of the Holy Lance at Antioch is the perfect example of this. The Crusaders are trapped in the city, starving, about to be wiped out. Then a poor pilgrim claims he had a vision of where the lance that pierced Christ's side was buried. The traditional story, the one the Crusaders told, is that finding this relic filled them with divine power and they charged out to victory. But modern historians like Asbridge have let's say, a more skeptical take. They point out that the Crusaders only attacked after their attempts to surrender were rejected. In this view, the lance wasn't a miracle, it was a brilliant piece of propaganda to motivate a terrified army into making one last desperate gamble. And believe it or not, this exact same thing happened right before Ascalon. A new relic is discovered in Jerusalem, a piece of the true cross itself, and it was carried right at the front of the army as they marched out to face a force twice their size. Miracle or psychological warfare? Either way, you can't deny its effect on morale. But we have to talk about the dark side of this religious fervor, because it was horrifying. When the Crusaders finally took Jerusalem, that piety turned into an absolute bloodbath. The Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir reports that over 70,000 people, men, women, and children, were killed. And this quote isn't from an enemy. It's from Fulcher of Chartres, a Christian priest who was actually there. His words just paint this gruesome, visceral picture of the slaughter. This was the brutal reality of an army that truly believed it was doing God's work. Okay, let's move to our final factor, and it's one that often gets overlooked. The Crusaders were anything but alone on their quest. The fact is, the Crusaders were totally dependent on a whole network of allies. At the start, the Byzantine emperor gave them food, expert guides, and military support to get them through Anatolia. Later on, fleets from Italian cities like Genoa became their literal lifeline, bringing supplies and, crucially, engineers. And all along the way, local Christian populations, especially Armenians, gave them food, shelter, and vital intelligence. Without all this help, the army would have starved or gotten lost long before they even saw Jerusalem. And this example from the Siege of Jerusalem shows you just how make or break that help was. The Crusaders get to the city and they're stuck. The defenders had stripped the whole area of trees, so they couldn't build siege towers. The entire crusade could have failed right there. But then, a few Genoese ships land at the nearby port. They took their own ships apart, hauled the timber overland, and used it to build the very towers that won the city. It's a perfect example. Without that Allied aid, at that exact moment, the First Crusade was over. So, let's pull all these threads together. When we look at this incredible victory, should we see it as some kind of destiny? Was it inevitable? You know, the best way to think about it is as a confluence, like where two rivers meet and become one. No single factor explains this. It was the unique combination of all four things happening at once that created this extraordinary result. The great historian Sir Stephen Runciman summed it up perfectly. He basically said that, yeah, the Crusaders' own efforts mattered, but their success was mostly thanks to outside forces, the allies who helped them, and even more importantly, the fact that their enemies were a complete mess. So let's recap the final score. Crusader leadership, brilliant in a crisis, but a liability the rest of the time. Muslim disunity, it was the critical vulnerability that gave them a fighting chance. Religious zeal, that was the high-octane fuel that kept the engine running when everything else was failing. And Allied aid, that provided the spare parts and expertise they needed to overcome specific, impossible challenges. You take away any one of those things, and the whole enterprise collapses. So, ultimately, the question is still there for us to debate. Was the victory at Ascalon and the success of the whole crusade a testament to incredible faith and strategy, or was it just an astonishing stroke of historical luck where a deeply flawed army managed to stumble through a door that its divided enemies had conveniently left wide open? The real answer is probably somewhere in the middle,